Every morning at exactly 7:15, Daniel walked through the front doors of Westfield High School with the same routine. Head down, earbuds in, moving quickly through the crowded hallways to his first period class. He had perfected the art of being invisible, or at least he thought he had. Daniel wasn't like the other kids at school. While they talked about weekend parties and expensive sneakers, he was thinking about his shift at the grocery store after school and whether his mom had enough money for groceries this week. His clothes came from thrift stores, his backpack had seen better days, and his lunch was usually a peanut butter sandwich he made himself before leaving for school. The thing about trying to be invisible is that sometimes it has the opposite effect. When you're different, when you don't fit in, people notice. And some people, the wrong kind of people, see that difference as an opportunity. Blake Morrison was one of those people. He was everything Daniel wasn't. Tall, confident, always wearing the latest brands and surrounded by a group of friends who followed his every move. Blake's dad owned 3 car dealerships in town, and Blake made sure everyone knew it. He drove a brand new truck to school, threw parties at his family's lake house, and had never worked a day in his life. It started small, the way these things usually do. A shoulder check in the hallway that seemed accidental, but happened too often to be coincidence. Snickering when Daniel pulled out his worn textbooks that the school had given him because he couldn't afford new ones. Comments about his clothes that were just loud enough for him to hear, but quiet enough that teachers missed them. Daniel tried to ignore it all. He had learned early in life that drawing attention to problems usually made them worse. When his dad left 3 years ago, his mom had struggled to keep their small apartment and put food on the table. Daniel had watched her work double shifts at the diner, coming home exhausted every night, and he decided then that he wouldn't add to her worries. So when Blake and his friends started their daily routine of making his life difficult, Daniel kept quiet. He told himself it would pass, that they would get bored and move on to someone else. He focused on his studies, knowing that good grades were his only ticket to a better future. But Blake wasn't the type to get bored easily. He seemed to enjoy the power he had over Daniel, the way he could make him uncomfortable with just a look or a comment. And his friends, kids like Tyler and Connor, were more than happy to follow his lead. They formed a perfect storm of teenage cruelty, feeding off each other's energy and escalating their behavior week by week. The first real incident happened on a Tuesday in October. Daniel was at his locker between classes trying to grab his chemistry book when Blake appeared beside him. Without warning, Blake slammed the locker door shut, nearly catching Daniel's fingers in the process. "Watch where you're going, loser," Blake said, even though Daniel hadn't been moving. His friends laughed like it was the funniest thing they'd ever heard. Daniel's heart was racing, but he kept his expression neutral. He waited for them to leave, then quietly opened his locker again and got his book. In chemistry class, his hands were still shaking slightly as he took notes, but he didn't tell anyone what had happened. That became the pattern. Blake would find new ways to make Daniel's day miserable, always when teachers weren't looking, always with his group of friends there to witness and encourage him. They would knock his books out of his hands in the hallway, making him scramble to pick up scattered papers while other students stepped around him. They would make loud comments about his lunch, his clothes, his hair, anything they could find to criticize. The worst part wasn't even the bullying itself. It was the way other students reacted. Some pretended not to see what was happening, walking past quickly with their eyes focused straight ahead. Others watched with a mixture of curiosity and relief, grateful that they weren't the ones being targeted. A few even laughed along, hoping to gain favor with Blake's group or at least avoid becoming their next victim. Daniel felt completely alone. He couldn't tell his mom because she was already struggling with her own problems. He couldn't tell the teachers because he had no proof, and Blake was smart enough to never cross any obvious lines when adults were around. And he couldn't fight back because Blake was bigger, stronger, and had backup. Instead, Daniel developed coping strategies. He learned Blake's schedule and tried to avoid being in the same hallways at the same time. He started eating lunch in the library instead of the cafeteria. He kept his head down even more than before, hoping that if he made himself small enough, maybe they would forget he existed. But deep down, Daniel was changing. The constant stress was wearing on him. His grades started to slip slightly, not because he wasn't smart enough, but because it was hard to concentrate when you were always looking over your shoulder. He stopped participating in class discussions, afraid that speaking up would draw more attention to himself. At home, he became more withdrawn. His mom noticed that he seemed tired all the time, that he wasn't eating as much as usual, that he spent more time in his room. When she asked if everything was okay, he would force a smile and tell her school was fine. He became an expert at hiding his emotions, at pretending everything was normal when inside he felt like he was drowning. The grocery store where Daniel worked after school became his refuge. There, he was just another employee stocking shelves and helping customers. His manager, Mr. Rodriguez, was kind to him and never made him feel like he wasn't good enough. For a few hours each day, Daniel could forget about Blake and his friends and just focus on the simple task of doing his job well. But every morning, he had to wake up and face another day at school. Another day of watching his back, of enduring the comments and the looks, of feeling like he was completely powerless to change his situation. He began to dread the sound of his alarm clock, the walk to school, the moment he would step through those front doors and become a target again. What Daniel didn't know was that his quiet endurance was about to be tested in ways he never imagined. Blake was growing more confident, more aggressive, and more determined to push Daniel to his breaking point. The small incidents were just the beginning of something much worse. November brought colder weather and a darker mood to Westfield High. Daniel noticed that Blake seemed more aggressive lately, more willing to push boundaries. What had started as casual harassment was becoming something more calculated and cruel. The first sign that things were escalating came during lunch period. Daniel had found what he thought was a safe spot in the library, eating his sandwich while working on homework. The librarian, Mrs. Patterson, usually kept troublemakers out, making it one of the few places Daniel felt he could relax. But Blake had apparently figured out Daniel's routine. He walked into the library with Tyler and Connor, carrying textbooks to make it look like they had legitimate business there. They sat at the table next to Daniel's, talking just loud enough for him to hear every word. "Man, can you smell that?" Blake said, wrinkling his nose in fake disgust. "Smells like someone brought their lunch from a dumpster," Tyler snickered. "Yeah, probably expired food. Some people can't afford fresh groceries, I guess." Daniel's face burned with embarrassment, but he kept his eyes on his homework. Around him, other students looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Mrs. Patterson was helping someone at the front desk and hadn't heard the comments. "Hey, poverty boy," Connor said, not quite loud enough to get in trouble but loud enough to make Daniel's stomach clench. "Maybe you should eat outside with the rest of the trash." Daniel packed up his things and left without finishing his sandwich. His hands were shaking as he walked to his next class, and he realized that even his safe space wasn't safe anymore. The harassment followed him everywhere now. In the hallways, Blake's group would form a wall, forcing Daniel to walk around them or wait for them to move. They would time their movements to bump into him, sending his books flying, then act like it was his fault for not watching where he was going. In gym class, it got worse. Coach Williams believed in building character through competition, which meant he rarely intervened when things got rough. During basketball games, Daniel would find himself constantly fouled by Blake and his friends. Elbows to the ribs, feet that appeared out of nowhere to trip him, hands that grabbed his shirt when the coach wasn't looking. "Oops. Sorry about that," Blake would say with a smirk after knocking Daniel to the ground. "Maybe you should work out more. You're kind of weak." The worst part was that some of the other students started joining in, not because they had anything against Daniel personally, but because picking on him had become socially acceptable. It was like Blake had given everyone permission to treat Daniel as less than human. In English class, when Daniel raised his hand to answer a question, students would roll their eyes or make quiet comments about him trying to show off. When he got papers back with good grades, someone would always make a comment about how studying was probably the only thing he was good at, since he had no life outside of school. The stress was affecting everything. Daniel's mom started asking more questions about why he seemed so tired and distracted. His grades, which had always been his source of pride, began to slip as he found it harder and harder to concentrate. At work, Mr. Rodriguez noticed that Daniel seemed jumpy and anxious, looking toward the door every time someone came into the store. "You okay, kid?" Mr. Rodriguez asked one evening as they were closing up. "You seem like you've got a lot on your mind lately." Daniel wanted to tell him everything, but what could an adult do about his problems at school? Instead, he just shrugged and said he was tired from studying for midterms. The breaking point of this phase came on a rainy Thursday in December. Daniel was walking to his locker after last period when he found a crowd gathered around it. As he got closer, his heart sank. Someone had spray-painted "loser" across his locker door in bright red letters. Blake and his friends were nowhere to be seen, but Daniel knew who was responsible. A few students were taking pictures with their phones, already planning to post them on social media. Others just stared, some looking sympathetic but none willing to say anything. Principal Hayes appeared quickly, having been called by a teacher who saw the commotion. He looked at the vandalism with a frown, then at Daniel with what might have been pity. "Do you know who did this?" he asked. Daniel shook his head. Even if he could prove it was Blake, what was the point? Blake's father was a major donor to the school district. Blake always had alibis, always had friends who would back up his story. And making accusations would only make things worse for Daniel in the long run. "Well, we'll have maintenance clean this up," Principal Hayes said. "In the meantime, you can use locker 247 down the hall. It's empty right now." As Daniel transferred his things to the new locker, he could feel dozens of eyes watching him. The humiliation was overwhelming. Everyone in school would hear about this within hours. The pictures would be shared on every social media platform, probably with cruel captions. That night, Daniel lay in bed staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. He thought about changing schools, but his mom couldn't afford private school, and they lived in the district for Westfield High. He thought about dropping out, but he knew that would destroy any chance he had for a better future. The next morning, he woke up to find that his prediction had been correct. Someone had created a meme using the picture of his vandalized locker, with text that read, "When you're so pathetic, even your locker knows it." It had been shared dozens of times across different platforms, with students from his school commenting and laughing. Blake found him before first period wearing an expression of fake concern. "Hey man, I heard about your locker. That's really messed up. I mean, whoever did that is just cruel." His friends snickered behind him, and Daniel realized this was all a game to them. They weren't just bullying him randomly. They were enjoying the psychological torture. They liked seeing him suffer, liked knowing they had power over him. "If you ever find out who did it, you should totally report them," Blake continued. "Nobody deserves to be treated like that." Daniel walked away without responding, but he could hear them laughing behind him. The message was clear. They could do whatever they wanted to him, and there was nothing he could do about it. The rest of December passed in a blur of constant harassment. Someone started a rumor that Daniel's family was on welfare, which wasn't true but spread anyway. His few possessions went missing from the gym locker room, his combination lock cut off and his clothes thrown in the trash. Notes appeared in his new locker calling him names and telling him he didn't belong at their school. By Christmas break, Daniel was a shadow of his former self. He had lost weight from stress and not eating enough. His grades had dropped from A's to B's and C's. He spent the holiday break working extra hours at the grocery store, grateful for any excuse not to think about returning to school. But the break had to end eventually. On the first day back in January, Daniel walked through those familiar doors knowing that Blake and his friends had probably spent their vacation thinking of new ways to make his life miserable. He was right to be worried. What Daniel didn't know was that Blake had big plans for the new semester. The casual harassment and small humiliations weren't enough anymore. Blake wanted to do something that would establish his dominance once and for all, something that would put Daniel in his place permanently. As Daniel walked to his first class, trying to make himself invisible as always, he had no idea that the worst was yet to come. The months of building pressure were about to reach a boiling point that would change everything. January was supposed to be a fresh start, but for Daniel, it felt like walking into a nightmare that had only gotten worse during the break. Blake seemed different when school resumed, more confident, more aggressive, like he had spent the holidays planning something big. The first week back, Daniel noticed Blake watching him more intently than usual. Not just the casual glances and smirks he was used to, but focused observation, like Blake was studying his habits and routines. It made Daniel's skin crawl, but he tried to ignore it and focus on his classes. The escalation started small. Blake began following Daniel between classes. Not close enough to be obvious, but near enough that Daniel always felt his presence. Tyler and Connor would position themselves at different points in the hallway, creating a triangle of intimidation that made Daniel feel trapped wherever he went. Then came the accidents in the cafeteria. Blake would bump into Daniel while he was carrying his lunch tray, sending food flying across the floor. The first time, Blake apologized loudly and offered to buy Daniel a new lunch, playing the role of the concerned student in front of the lunch staff. But his eyes held a different message entirely. "So clumsy of me," Blake said with fake sincerity. "Good thing it was just your cheap sandwich and not real food." By the third accident in 2 weeks, Daniel stopped buying lunch altogether. He couldn't afford to keep losing food, and he couldn't handle the humiliation of being on his hands and knees cleaning up spilled milk while other students laughed and took pictures. The psychological pressure was becoming unbearable. Daniel found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, changing his routes between classes, even skipping bathroom breaks because he was afraid of being cornered alone. His sleep suffered as he lay awake at night thinking about what tomorrow might bring. At home, his mom finally confronted him about his obvious distress. "Daniel, I know something's wrong," she said one evening as they sat at their small kitchen table. "You barely eat, you're always tired, and you seem scared all the time. What's going on at school?" Daniel wanted desperately to tell her everything, but what could she do? They couldn't afford to move to a different district, and his mom was already working herself to exhaustion just to keep them afloat. The last thing he wanted was for her to worry about problems she couldn't solve. "I'm just stressed about keeping my grades up," he lied. "College applications are coming up soon and I need my scholarship opportunities." His mom looked like she wanted to push further, but she was too tired from her own struggles to dig deeper. That night, Daniel heard her crying quietly in her bedroom, and he knew she was blaming herself for not being able to provide a better life for him. The guilt made everything worse. Now Daniel wasn't just dealing with the constant harassment at school. He was also carrying the weight of his mom's pain and his own inability to protect her from it. He felt like he was drowning, and there was no one to throw him a life preserver. February brought a new level of cruelty that Daniel hadn't experienced before. Blake had apparently gotten bored with the physical intimidation and moved on to character assassination. Rumors began spreading through the school's social media groups, lies about Daniel's family, his personal hygiene, even suggestions that he was dangerous or unstable. The lies were so outrageous that anyone who knew Daniel should have recognized them as false. But high school students aren't always interested in truth when gossip is more entertaining. The rumors spread like wildfire, and suddenly Daniel found himself completely isolated. Even the few students who had been neutral toward him started avoiding him. Teachers began looking at him differently too. When the rumors suggested he might be violent, some instructors started watching him more closely, misinterpreting his withdrawn behavior as suspicious rather than recognizing it as the result of months of abuse. The isolation was crushing. Daniel had never been popular, but he had at least been invisible. Now he was visible in the worst possible way, as someone to be feared and avoided. He ate lunch alone in empty classrooms, walked the halls like a ghost, and sat by himself in every class. Blake seemed to feed off Daniel's misery. He would make eye contact across crowded rooms and smile, a cold expression that said he was enjoying every moment of Daniel's suffering. Sometimes he would even approach Daniel with fake concern, asking loudly if he was okay or if he needed someone to talk to, all while his friends snickered in the background. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon in late February. Daniel was walking to the parking lot after school, exhausted from another day of whispers and stares when he realized Blake and his entire group were following him, not just the usual 3 or 4 guys, but at least 8 students, including some girls who had never bothered with Daniel before. Daniel's heart started racing. He had managed to avoid being alone with Blake's group for months, but somehow they had cornered him in the one place where there were no teachers around. The parking lot was mostly empty except for a few students getting into their cars, and none of them seemed interested in what was happening. "Hey, Daniel," Blake called out, his voice carrying across the asphalt. "Wait up, man. We want to talk to you." Daniel quickened his pace, but he knew it was useless. Blake's group spread out, cutting off his escape routes. They weren't running or being obviously aggressive. They were just walking with purpose, herding him like predators cornering prey. When Daniel reached his mom's old car, he fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely get them in the lock. Before he could open the door, Blake was there, one hand pressed against the car window, blocking Daniel's escape. "Going somewhere?" Blake asked with that same cold smile. We haven't had a chance to really talk in a while. I feel like we should get to know each other better." Tyler appeared on Daniel's other side while Connor positioned himself behind the car. The rest of the group formed a loose circle, some of them pulling out their phones to record what was about to happen. "Look at him shaking," one of the girls said with a laugh. "He's so scared he can barely stand up." Daniel's mouth was dry, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. He had never felt so helpless, so completely at the mercy of people who seemed to enjoy his suffering. Every instinct told him to run, but there was nowhere to go. "Please," Daniel said quietly, his voice barely audible. "Just leave me alone." Blake leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that only Daniel could hear. "Leave you alone? But we're just getting started. You see, I've been thinking about our relationship and I realized something. You've never properly shown me the respect I deserve." The word respect hit Daniel like a physical blow. This wasn't about anything he had done or failed to do. This was about power, about Blake's need to dominate someone he saw as weak. Daniel realized with crystal clarity that nothing he could say or do would ever be enough to make this stop. Blake reached into Daniel's car and grabbed his backpack from the passenger seat. Before Daniel could react, Blake dumped the contents onto the asphalt. Books, papers, pens, and personal items scattered across the ground, some of them sliding under nearby cars. "Oops," Blake said with mock concern. "Looks like you dropped something." The group laughed as Daniel dropped to his knees, desperately trying to gather his scattered belongings. Some of his homework blew away in the wind, and he watched helplessly as weeks of work disappeared across the parking lot. But the worst moment came when Blake picked up a small photograph that had fallen from Daniel's wallet. It was a picture of Daniel with his father, taken just before his dad had left 3 years ago. It was one of the few photos Daniel had of them together, and he carried it everywhere as a reminder of better times. Blake held up the photo so everyone could see it. "Aw, look at this. Is this your daddy? Where is he now? Oh wait, let me guess. He left because he was embarrassed to have such a pathetic son." The cruelty of the comment took Daniel's breath away. Blake had found the one thing that could hurt him more than any physical attack, and he was twisting the knife with surgical precision. The group laughed even harder, some of them making additional comments about Daniel's father. For months, Daniel had endured everything they threw at him. He had stayed silent, kept his head down, tried to make himself invisible. But watching Blake hold his father's photo, listening to him mock the one relationship that had meant everything to Daniel, something inside him finally snapped. Daniel stood up slowly, his scattered belongings forgotten on the asphalt. For the first time in months, he looked Blake directly in the eyes. His voice was quiet but steady as he spoke. "Give me the photo back." Blake seemed surprised by the change in Daniel's demeanor. For just a moment, his confident smirk faltered. Then he laughed and held the photo higher. "What are you going to do about it?" Blake taunted. "You going to cry? Going to run to mommy?" Daniel took a step forward. "Give me the photo back." The parking lot had gone quiet. Even Blake's friends seemed to sense that something had shifted, that the dynamic they were used to had suddenly changed. Blake looked around at his audience, realizing that he had pushed things to a point where he needed to either back down or escalate dramatically. He chose to escalate. "You want it so bad," Blake said, holding the photo between his thumb and forefinger. "Come and take it. What happened next would change everything for everyone involved." Daniel's months of silence, his careful strategy of staying invisible, his determination to avoid confrontation at any cost, all of it was about to come to an end in a way that no one, especially Blake, was prepared for. The silence in the parking lot stretched for what felt like an eternity. Blake stood there holding the photograph, waiting for Daniel to either back down like always or make some pathetic attempt to grab it. What he didn't expect was for Daniel to simply stand there, completely still, with a look in his eyes that none of them had ever seen before. "I said, give me the photo back," Daniel repeated, his voice calm but carrying an undertone that made several students take an unconscious step backward. Blake felt a flicker of uncertainty, but pushed it down. He had an audience, a reputation to maintain. There was no way he was going to be intimidated by the same kid he'd been pushing around for months. "Make me," Blake said, and started to tear the corner of the photograph. That's when everything changed. Daniel moved faster than anyone expected, closing the distance between them in 2 quick steps. But instead of grabbing desperately for the photo like Blake anticipated, Daniel did something that shocked everyone present. He stopped just inches from Blake's face and spoke in a voice so quiet that only Blake could hear him. "You have no idea who you're messing with," Daniel said. "Give me the photo, walk away, and we'll pretend this never happened." There was something in Daniel's tone, in his posture, in the way he carried himself that was completely different from the scared, submissive student they all knew. Blake felt a chill run down his spine, but his pride wouldn't let him back down in front of so many people. "Are you threatening me?" Blake said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Did everyone hear that? "The freak just threatened me." Before Daniel could respond, a car pulled into the parking lot. Mrs. Henderson, the vice principal, had been driving by and noticed the crowd gathered around the cars. She parked quickly and walked over, her expression stern. "What's going on here?" she demanded, looking at the scattered belongings on the ground and the obvious tension in the group. Blake immediately switched into his innocent act. "Nothing, Mrs. Henderson. Daniel here just dropped his stuff and we were helping him pick it up. But then he got all aggressive and started threatening me." Several of Blake's friends nodded in agreement, backing up his story. "Yeah, he said he was going to hurt Blake," Tyler added. "We were just standing here and he went crazy." Mrs. Henderson looked at Daniel, who was still standing perfectly still, his eyes never leaving Blake's face. "Is this true, Daniel? Did you threaten another student?" Daniel finally broke eye contact with Blake and looked at Mrs. Henderson. "He has something that belongs to me," he said simply. "I just want it back." Blake held up his hands in a gesture of innocence, the photograph hidden in his palm. "I don't know what he's talking about. We were just trying to be nice and he freaked out." Mrs. Henderson frowned. Based on what she could see and what multiple students were telling her, it looked like Daniel was the aggressor. She had heard some concerning rumors about him lately, and this seemed to confirm her worst fears. "Daniel, I think you need to come to the office with me," she said. "Everyone else get to your cars and go home." This gathering is over. As the crowd began to disperse, Blake made a show of walking away with his friends. But as he passed Daniel, he accidentally dropped something on the ground. It was the photograph, but now it was torn in half. Daniel looked down at the ruined photo of him and his father, and something inside him went completely cold. Mrs. Henderson was already walking toward her car, expecting him to follow, but Daniel couldn't move. He stared at the torn pieces of the only picture he had of one of the few happy moments in his life. "Daniel, let's go," Mrs. Henderson called impatiently. Daniel bent down and picked up the pieces of the photograph with hands that were surprisingly steady. As he stood up, he noticed that several students were still recording with their phones, probably hoping to catch his breakdown for social media. Instead, Daniel surprised them all by smiling. It wasn't a happy smile or a sad smile. It was the smile of someone who had just realized that they had absolutely nothing left to lose. The next morning, Daniel didn't show up for school. Mrs. Henderson had called his mother the night before to discuss the incident in the parking lot, and for the first time, Daniel told his mom everything. Every detail of the months of harassment, every humiliation, every moment he had suffered in silence to protect her from worry. His mother was devastated, not just because of what Daniel had endured, but because she realized how much he had been carrying alone. They stayed up most of the night talking, and by morning she had made some phone calls of her own. When Daniel finally returned to school 3 days later, things were very different. Principal Hayes called him to the office first thing in the morning, but this time Daniel wasn't in trouble. "Daniel," Principal Hayes said, looking uncomfortable, "I owe you an apology. We received some information yesterday that puts the incident in the parking lot in a very different light. It turned out that one of the students recording the confrontation had captured more than just the final moments. The video clearly showed Blake taking Daniel's belongings, dumping them on the ground, and taunting him with the photograph. It also captured audio of Blake's cruel comments about Daniel's father, but that wasn't the most shocking revelation. We also received a call from someone who recognized you from the video," Principal Hayes continued. "Someone from the youth center downtown. They told us about your volunteer work there, about the self-defense classes you teach to younger kids who are being bullied." Daniel's secret was out. For the past 2 years, he had been quietly volunteering at a community center in the rougher part of town, using skills his father had taught him before leaving to help other kids who were going through what he was experiencing. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had been teaching others to stand up for themselves while he suffered in silence. "They also told us about your father," Principal Hayes said quietly, about his military service, about the commendations he received before things went wrong for your family. The truth about Daniel's father was complicated. He had been a decorated soldier, a martial arts instructor, and Daniel's hero. But he had also struggled with addiction and depression after his service, ultimately leaving the family when his problems became too much to handle. Daniel had been protecting his father's memory just as much as he had been protecting his mother's feelings. The point is, Principal Hayes continued, we realize now that you have been showing remarkable restraint in an impossible situation. The fact that you never retaliated, never used your obvious skills to defend yourself, shows a level of maturity and self-control that's honestly impressive. Word spread through the school faster than any rumor ever had. By lunchtime, everyone knew that the quiet kid they had been watching get bullied for months was actually trained in martial arts. They knew he had been volunteering to help other kids, that his father had been a war hero, that he had chosen not to fight back despite clearly being able to defend himself. Blake found himself in a very different position. The video of him tormenting Daniel had gone viral, but not in the way he had intended. Comments poured in from people disgusted by his behavior, especially towards someone whose family had sacrificed for their country. Blake's father, whose business reputation depended on community goodwill, was furious. But the real shock came when people started sharing stories about Daniel that they had never told before. Teachers talked about his academic excellence despite his circumstances. Coworkers from the grocery store described his work ethic and kindness to customers. Kids from the youth center posted videos talking about how Daniel had helped them find confidence and stand up to their own bullies. The narrative that Blake had created, of Daniel as a weak, pathetic loser, crumbled completely. In its place emerged the story of a young man who had chosen strength over violence, service over selfishness, and dignity over revenge, even when he was being pushed to his absolute limit. Daniel had spent months trying to be invisible, and now he found himself more visible than ever, but this time it was for all the right reasons. Students who had ignored his suffering now looked at him with respect and admiration. Teachers who had never noticed him began to see his true character. Most importantly, other students who had been suffering in silence began to speak up. Daniel's story gave them permission to tell their own stories, to ask for help, to believe that things could get better. The quiet kid who had tried so hard to avoid attention had accidentally become exactly what his school needed to, reminder that true strength isn't about intimidating others, but about lifting them up even when you're struggling yourself. The weeks following the revelation transformed Westfield High in ways no one could have predicted. Daniel found himself at the center of a completely different kind of attention, and for the first time in months, he could walk through the hallways without fear. The change in how people treated him was dramatic and immediate. Students who had previously looked right through him now nodded respectfully when they passed. Some even stopped to thank him for his work at the youth center, sharing stories about younger siblings or friends who had benefited from programs, like the one Daniel supported, but perhaps the most surprising change was in the students who had been silent witnesses to his months of suffering. Many of them approached Daniel privately, expressing regret for not speaking up when they saw what was happening to him. They explained their fear of becoming targets themselves, and Daniel found himself in the unexpected position of offering forgiveness and understanding. "I get it," he told Ashley, a girl from his English class who had tearfully apologized for not intervening. "I was scared too. We all were. The important thing is that we do better going forward." The school administration, embarrassed by how badly they had mishandled the situation, implemented new anti-bullying policies almost overnight. They established anonymous reporting systems, brought in counselors to work with both victims and perpetrators, and began training teachers to recognize the signs of harassment that had been happening right under their noses. Blake, meanwhile, was facing consequences he had never imagined possible. The viral video had reached far beyond the school, and the public backlash was severe. His father's car dealerships faced boycotts from community members disgusted by his son's behavior toward a military family. Blake himself was suspended from school and required to attend counseling sessions and perform community service. The community service assignment was particularly fitting. Blake was required to spend his afternoons at the same youth center where Daniel volunteered. The first day he showed up angry and resentful, he expected to be met with hostility. Instead, Daniel simply handed him a broom and showed him which areas needed to be cleaned. "Why are you being nice to me?" Blake asked after several uncomfortable minutes of working in silence. "After everything I did to you, why aren't you trying to get revenge?" Daniel paused in his work of setting up chairs for an after-school program. "Because revenge won't help anyone," he said simply. "And because I think you're probably just as scared and confused as I was, just for different reasons." It was the beginning of an unlikely transformation. Blake had spent so much time focused on maintaining his image and asserting dominance that he had never stopped to think about why he felt the need to tear others down. Working alongside the kids at the youth center, many of whom came from backgrounds similar to Daniel's, forced him to confront some uncomfortable truths about himself. The kids at the center didn't know about Blake's reputation at school. They just saw another teenager who was there to help them with homework, play games, and listen to their problems. For the first time in his life, Blake experienced what it felt like to be valued for his actions rather than his family's money or his social status. Meanwhile, Daniel's life was changing in ways he had never expected. His story had attracted attention from beyond the school community. Local news stations wanted to interview him about bullying and resilience. A regional martial arts organization offered him a scholarship to attend advanced training camps. College recruiters who had never heard of him before began sending letters expressing interest in his academic achievements and community service. But the most meaningful change was in his relationship with his mother. The secret was finally out about what he had been enduring, and while she felt guilty for not recognizing the signs earlier, she was also incredibly proud of how her son had handled an impossible situation. "You know what your father would say if he could see you now?" she told him one evening as they sat together at their small kitchen table. "He would say that you became the man he always hoped you could be, even without him there to guide you." It was the first time in years that they had talked about Daniel's father without pain dominating the conversation. Daniel had spent so long trying to live up to an impossible standard, trying to be perfect enough to somehow bring his father back, that he had never realized he was already becoming something his father would be proud of. The torn photograph that had started the final confrontation had been carefully taped back together and now sat framed on Daniel's desk. The tear was still visible, but somehow that made it more precious rather than less. It was a reminder that broken things could be repaired, that damage didn't have to be permanent. At school, Daniel found himself in the strange position of being sought out by other students who were dealing with their own problems. Kids who were being bullied, kids who were struggling at home, kids who just needed someone to listen without judgment. Daniel realized that his experience, painful as it had been, had given him something valuable: the ability to help others who were going through similar struggles. He started eating lunch in the cafeteria again, but now he was rarely alone. A diverse group of students had begun sitting together at what they jokingly called the survivors' table. Kids who had all faced various challenges and found strength in supporting each other. It wasn't a formal support group, just friends who understood that everyone was fighting battles that others couldn't see. Blake's transformation was slower and more difficult, but it was real. The community service that had started as punishment gradually became something he looked forward to. He discovered that he actually enjoyed working with the younger kids, that there was satisfaction in helping rather than hurting. His relationship with his father became strained as Blake began questioning the values he had been raised with, but he also began developing his own sense of right and wrong. One afternoon, about 2 months after the parking lot incident, Blake approached Daniel at the youth center. They had been working together for weeks, but Blake had never managed to find the words for what he really wanted to say. "Daniel," he said, his voice uncertain, "I know I can never undo what I did to you. I know saying sorry doesn't fix months of making your life hell, but I need you to know that I understand now how wrong I was, and I'm going to spend whatever time it takes making sure nothing like that ever happens to anyone else." Daniel looked at Blake for a long moment. He could see the genuine remorse in his former tormentor's eyes, could hear the sincerity in his voice. But more than that, he could see the change in how Blake interacted with the kids at the center, the patience and kindness he showed to children who had every reason to distrust teenagers like him. "Thank you for saying that," Daniel replied. "And thank you for proving that people can change." They weren't friends, and they probably never would be. Too much had happened for their relationship to ever be simple. But they had found a way to work together toward something positive, and that felt like enough. As spring arrived at Westfield High, the atmosphere in the school had shifted dramatically. The culture of casual cruelty that had allowed Daniel's suffering to continue for so long was being replaced by something healthier. Students were more likely to speak up when they saw bullying happening. Teachers were more aware of the signs of harassment. And perhaps most importantly, kids who were struggling knew they had options and support. Daniel never became popular in the traditional sense. He was still quiet, still more comfortable with books than with parties. But he was respected in a way that mattered more than popularity. He had shown his entire school community what real strength looked like, and in doing so, he had made it easier for everyone else to find their own courage. The story that had started with a scared kid trying to be invisible had become something much larger. A reminder that everyone has the power to choose how they respond to difficulty, and that sometimes the quietest voices carry the most important messages. On graduation day, as Daniel walked across the stage to receive his diploma and several scholarships that would make college possible, he thought about how different his life looked now compared to those dark months when he had felt completely hopeless. The path hadn't been easy and the pain had been real, but he had discovered something valuable about himself and about the possibility for change in others. In the audience, his mother cheered loudly, and he could see kids from the youth center holding signs with his name. Even Blake was there, applauding along with everyone else. It was a moment Daniel had never imagined possible during those lonely lunches in the library, but it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Sometimes the people who seem the most powerless turn out to be the ones who change everything. Sometimes standing up for yourself means first learning to stand up for others. And sometimes the hardest battles are won not through violence, but through the simple act of refusing to let cruelty win. Daniel's story was far from over, but he had learned the most important lesson of all, that true strength comes not from never falling down, but from always choosing to get back up.